Welcome back, everyone. Today we'll be discussing the eugenics movement in our final look at disabled history in America, and we'll be looking at it through the lens of how has being disabled in America affected people's social opportunities. So I want to start with a quick do now. Is it ever okay for a government to make medical decisions for its citizens? So just think about that for a second and pause the video and think about that. Okay. So, is it ever okay for a government to make medical decisions for its citizens? I would argue yes, when it's a matter of public safety. So, for example, vaccinations. It's okay for the government to require vaccinations because it could mean there could be pandemics like the COVID-19 pandemic we're experiencing now. It's okay for the government to mandate that people get the COVID vaccine because without it, thousands more people are going to die. But outside of public safety, it's not really okay for a government to make medical decisions for its citizens. So I want to talk about the eugenics movement. So it was a popular movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries based on false ideas about genetics and social Darwinism. Its followers believed that success and status were determined by genes, and they advocated for forced sterilization of quote unquote unfit members of society, and these included racial minorities, poor, disabled, and mentally ill people. Their goal was to weed out the quote unquote bad genes from humanity and leave only good. So, if you see on the left, there's a poster here that's essentially eugenics propaganda talking about the unfit human traits. So feeble mindedness, epilepsy, criminality, insanity, alcoholism, pauperism. And they're saying that these run in families and are inherited, and that they can breed out the unfitness in 3 generations. So they're really talking about eliminating people based off of and sterilizing people based off of not even science. It's just um, I don't even know what you call it. False science doesn't seem strong enough. So disability at the time was treated very badly, as you can see the poster on the right here. Some people are born to be a burden on the rest, is how disabled people were viewed. Physically and mentally disabled people were treated the same. They were placed in asylums or institutions where doctors performed cruel therapies like electroshock shock and hydrotherapies, as well as lobotomies. They were seen as unfit or lesser, and many disabled people fell prey to the eugenics movement. Adults underwent forced sterilization, and children were allowed to die by doctors. So, one example of the eugenics movement in the US was the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924. It was one of several similar state laws passed in the US during the eugenics movement. It stated that any patient in a state hospital could be forcibly sterilized by the discretion of the superintendent for any reason, and that um, it required the approval of the board of directors of the hospital, but not the patient or their family. So it's taking away the right to consent for medical procedures from the patient or anyone standing in for them. Under this law, Virginia sterilized over 7,000 people between 1924 and 1979. So, one case that fought this was Buck v. Bell. Um, Carrie Buck was an 18-year-old woman who you can see here on the right. She's the one with the black hair. She was forcibly sterilized by the superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. His name was John Hendren Bell. On May 2nd, 1927, in an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Buck, her mother, who's on Buck's right, and her daughter, Buck's daughter, were feeble minded and promiscuous, and that her sterilization was in the state's interest. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the ruling, arguing that the interests of public welfare outweighed the interests of individuals. Buck v. Bell legitimized sterilization in the U.S. until the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. So, just for our exit slip, why do you think the Supreme Court ruled on Buck v. Bell the way they did? What is the purpose of the Supreme Court? Did it fail in this instance? So, just pause the video and think about that question for a minute. Okay, so I think the Supreme Court ruled on Buck v. Bell did the way they did because the justices believed that the sterilization was in the better interests of the public, because they believed that people who don't fit how society thinks people should be or act don't deserve to live, essentially. So they're trying to stop characteristics that they don't agree with from existing in society. So the Supreme Court's purpose is to strike down laws that are unconstitutional. And I would argue that it did fail in this instance because it failed to protect the right to liberty that is stated in the Constitution, the right to liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that is guaranteed to every citizen. Belle, her mother, and her daughter were all citizens of the US, and they all deserved a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And because of the sterilization, they were denied that. And the Supreme Court failed to strike down a law that should have been seen as unconstitutional because of their own personal biases. So they did fail in this instance. As usual, I will link the primary source document in the description. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next and final video of this series.